Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast, a show dedicated to modern learning and development. With your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock.
It's podcast day. Welcome to the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock, and I'm here with your co-host, Daniel Mendonca. Daniel, it's been a while, and we are back. Season 2. How you doing?
Doing well, Scott. Happy to be back. Last week I flew solo while Sabrina was there along for the ride, but it was a lot of fun. But I'm happy you're back. I have the one thing that you and I have both determined is when we don't podcast and plan for the podcast, you and I talk a lot less during the week.
Yeah, it's been a little sad over the winter. A little isolated. Feel like I missed the connection with Daniel. We don't have as many meetings, I guess, when we don't force them for the podcast. So I'm glad we're back. We're in a rhythm. Hopefully, we can just keep going. Got a lot of fun stuff for this season. Daniel highlighted a lot of that in the episode last week. Encourage you to go check that out as well. However, I did find out that when Dad goes away and I let the kids play at the microphones, Daniel overpromises and said we were going to have 8 topics today. Upon reviewing, we said, you know what? We don't want to get too crazy, and so we're going to cut it down to 4 today. We're going to put a little rules and little restrictions but we have 4 items today that we think are kind of cool trends, stuff we're seeing for the year, and we want to be able to talk about those with you today. Ultimately, there really were 8 things. We just decided a few of them could be kind of grouped together, so we're going to talk about a few topics in each segment. So that's what we're talking about today. Really excited to get started. Let's go. All right, so in our first segment, we want to talk about some of the impacts of 2020. Obviously, it was an interesting year and a lot of challenges, a lot of changes for people, a lot of opportunities for growth, and a lot of just hurdles that people had to kind of navigate and overcome. And we want to talk about some of what that was and then how we think that's going to impact 2021. Now, as we talk today, one of the things I want to just highlight is we're going to reference some numbers and some statistics that came out of a survey that was done through Training Industry. It was a survey for an article called Large Majority of People Want to Continue Some Form of Flexible Working, and that's by Jane Smith. So we want to give due credit to where some of this information is coming from as we talk through it. So just on the front side, so you know where that's coming from. These numbers aren't pulled just out of thin air as we might want to do from time to time, but this time real numbers, so good stuff to back us up. All right, so obviously 2020, we have COVID, which changes the entire landscape of a lot of our work environments. People are working more from home, they're working more remotely, their offices are closed due to safety and health concerns, and some of the logistics of that has changed, and obviously that shifts the landscape of how we deliver messages, communications, teamwork, social interactions, and ultimately training as a part of that as well. So a couple things that we're seeing as we move from that, and people have adapted, and what we're going to kind of look at in 2021. I'll give a couple numbers and we can kind of talk through what we think that means. But 56% of companies are currently in the process of retooling their training programs, meaning something about the way they did it in January and February of 2020 had to change over the course of the last 10 months. And as we know, shifting an entire training philosophy and your program overnight is just not really possible in most cases. So many companies are still in that mode of trying to get everything moved over. I think you're going to continue to see some of that. And then 62% of people are spending more time on training due to COVID changes. So that's an interesting statistic that I think we can really dive into. But basically, people are training more on for various reasons and in different ways, I think. But we'll talk a little bit about that. Daniel, what do you see when you hear those two numbers as sort of your first take on what's coming?
Yeah, I think that when you I don't think anybody's probably shocked at those numbers. I think when I first saw them, there was a part of me that was kind of thinking that in my head, like, those seem low. But the biggest thing I take from that, and it seems to be the trend that's coming into 2021, and we have talked about it in the past, is that people are more open. Leadership is more open to analyzing the way they're currently doing things and seeing how they can do it better, because their hands has been forced. And I think that's really, really positive. I think spending more time on training is fantastic. I think that in all areas of business, it's an increasing digital world, but the people aspect is so important, and is growing in importance. It's this really like weird balance of we're going more digitally, but people are continuously being more important. So the fact that people are diving into training is great. And I think that reaching reaching people or training people the way they want to be trained or they prefer to be trained is something that is a big takeaway from those numbers and what's going to come this year.
Yeah, if I'm going to make an assumption, and I'm hoping I'm right, and if I'm not, that'll be a little bit sad. But I'm assuming when we see 56% of companies are retooling their training programs, I'm hoping that the other 44% we're already in the process of shifting to this methodology, to thinking more digitally and thinking more remote and thinking about greater options for their teammates to make choices on their own, and not that 44% of people are going to say no, status quo. I don't want to change anything. I'm hoping that that's the case, that we just had some people that were ahead of the curve. Likelihood is it's not all 44% are thinking that way or have already made that move. But I think 56% of people are thinking differently, and that's awesome. I love that way of, forced or not, that companies are having to think differently. I think the 62% of people spending more time, I actually did think that was a little low. But one of the things I think is really important around that is it's not just that they're training more for work. I think we are in a position now where, whether it be through furloughs or, let's face it, there's some unemployment challenges in the U.S. and people are having to retool for themselves, not just a particular job or role they have. I think that's probably part of it. People are willing to train more on their own for personal time, for personal development, which might lead to professional development. But I think a lot of people are trying to find ways to upskill or reskill their own sets, and taking that time that they have. We're all stuck inside for the most part still, or at least we're trying to be more cognizant of that. And I think a good way to spend some of that time is reading more. I know Sabrina mentioned that on the podcast last time, is that she's found more time to read in this environment, and I think people are reading for training purposes. They're taking this content online. We're also seeing, even in a personal space, master classes and these other software and program developments that are out there that are designed for you to find an interest, find a hobby, find a passion, and learn from experts. And those are growing in popularity as well. So not just your work environment or your work LMS. I love that people hopefully are training for both personal and professional development.
Yeah, when you first see the statistic and the industry we're in and the world we live in, day in and day out, you start to think about work. But the reality of it is, I've seen so many people just do things for their growth of their knowledge, take online courses, take free LinkedIn learning classes, other things like that, just to train. So that's great to hear. And everybody has more time, and the fact that they're looking to better themselves and grow themselves is a fantastic positive to all of this.
And there's a weird phenomenon too that we'll go a little bit past training. Sorry, I'm going to take one of my dad tangents here and go off on a adventure with everyone here. But the reality is, I've always been a big proponent of when you aren't so focused on a set time limit in your world, and I always used to call it the button seat kind of theory, right? Like if my boss said, "Oh, the only way you're getting work done is if you're sitting at your desk all day long," I always challenged that, and I said, "But there's distractions in the office," and I've actually been someone who really enjoys remote work, and I tend to find I actually work more, not because I'm forced to, not because I'm required to, but because I enjoy the work and I can be more flexible in my time, and I might pick up after the kids go to bed and do a little work overnight, catching up on emails or writing up a document or whatever that might be. I think the same is true in training when you're not having it kind of forced or compliance. And obviously there's part of that to training in general, but when it's kind of your choice to do and you can do it at any time, not just when you're on the clock, I think you choose to just do more. You're more open to that notion. And I think there's something to be found in that kind of philosophy as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just not to extend this segment any too much further, but I think the idea of I have time, my job interests me, I'm interested in this role. If reading a blog or listening to a podcast while I'm working out or whatever it is allows tomorrow to be easier and you to be more successful, I think a lot of people have found the time and made the time to do that now.
All right, so we've got a number that may not surprise many people as we've gone into this world. I'm actually a little surprised by the first number I'm going to give you, which is 77%. So in 2017, 77% of companies had incorporated some form of virtual training into their curriculums. Now, what does virtual training there mean? It could mean things like e-learnings and the ability to go into your LMS and take content that way, or it could actually be like virtual content and classroom programs. It's a little ill-defined there, but what's not surprising is that in 2020, that number jumped to 98% of organizations had to implement some kind of a virtual training program. Again, not a number that I think would surprise us, but it is going to highlight exactly what we want to talk about. One of the other things to think about here is that of companies that had comprehensive training programs, basically meaning that they were well developed and expertly rolled out or had good operational strategies around the rollout, they experienced approximately 218% higher revenues per employee, and they also experienced 24% higher profit margins. Basically meaning if you train your employees with a well thought out, well operationalized program, you're going to have better success. I don't think any of us would find that to be a shocking revelation. Maybe the numbers haven't been as applied in some other studies. But the reality is if you train your employees, we tend to believe that will ultimately result in greater success. What I'd like to focus on for this segment as we talk about these things is that importance of that virtual training and what it means to an organization. I know in past episodes we've talked about this a few times, but the importance of understanding that a virtually led program is different than a in-seat, in-person type of training, and that you need to prepare your trainers and your facilitators to be in a space that enables them to be successful. And I think that really is the important thing coming out of those numbers.
Yeah, I think the note here we have is the monumental adoption of virtual training, and I really do think it is that, because even of that 70% that were already doing it, as the statistic was taken in 2017, I think, Scott, what you said is probably key. A couple of e-learnings, maybe 30, 60-minute seat time trainings on health and safety and WMIS and all those other things that you have to take. I think that's changed and grown significantly, and the way people have adopted that inside that 77% has probably changed as well. And I think what you outlined in training the trainers, I think is going to be the overall key to the success of this. I guess, Scott, a question that I have for you is, if you take a virtual training, maybe it's a virtual instructor-led training, or maybe it's something you're taking content that's usually delivered in person and putting it online. I guess, how important is the actual facilitator in the process, or is it the content that you're putting out?
I think that, I mean, I hate to be just a fence sitter on this one, but I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think both are really important. When I'm thinking of like train the trainer, and I think there's a huge demand for rethinking the way you deliver a message via a virtual event, particularly like if it's not a conference, but like a classroom setting. I think you're going to have to get trainers in the mindset that they don't have 5, 6, 7, 8 hours in a class during a day. They're now maybe getting an hour or 2 hours. And even if I think back to the 2017 study and those numbers you're seeing, how many of us knew what Zoom was 4 years ago? That was a notion that hadn't really probably come into play. We'd all had WebEx meetings maybe for in business type of settings for a conference call, but really hadn't thought of it as a vehicle to deliver a message and facilitate. So I think facilitators have to think differently in that sense. Now, I think with that also comes the fact you are going to have to adjust your content to also meet that same realm where you may have had 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours to deliver a message. You have to figure out, how do I make this concise? How do I start to break things up? We talk about micro learning a lot. And how does that come to play? I think the content itself also has to be tailored to help that facilitator. The last one more note I have on all of this is I'm a little nervous if I'm giving my sort of view on what I see, is that we're going to see a heavy pendulum swing, as the industry often tends to do, where we're going to train everyone for virtual only. And I think we would all hope that someday we're able to at least come back to the middle and get some of this to be in person again, as well as virtual. Make sure your trainers they're going to have to kind of understand two roles. How do I teach virtually, and how do I teach in person? So I don't want to, all of a sudden just start training people to only teach a 1-hour class online. They're going to need to step into a classroom and understand how to manage that as well. So I think you have to train them for both, in my opinion on this. I'm always nervous that the pendulum swing kind of goes in the other direction. We find ourselves having to counterbalance in a few years back the other way.
I think that's a great point. I do think those swings definitely happen. It's interesting for me about just how many people are fully adopted to it, but I think people's mentality has really gone a different way and has swung back and forth throughout the last year and lead into this year. So if you talked, and Scott, you work remotely on the average day, even when there isn't a pandemic going on, but if you talk to people in April and May and June, there was a lot of like, oh my God, I love working at home. Oh yeah, these, the flexibility of online meetings, things just being an email instead of being pulled into a boardroom. And then like July, August, September came around, and like all these articles and health studies about Zoom fatigue and people being out of it. And I mean, I'm sure you noticed the amount of people who are off camera now, and adding into a meeting invite on camera or off camera is a real thing. And um, so I think people's desire and comfort and want to do the virtual thing is starting to wean out, and people, I think, would sell a body part to be able to get on a plane and fly to a training center and train people in person nowadays. So it is interesting to see that, but I don't think the adoption of virtual training is going away regardless, and it's going to be a major trend for 2021 because it's I don't want to call it inexpensive, but it's cost effective, and you can train a lot more people in a shorter period of time. And I know that one of our customers that both you and I have reviewed data on has to train people within the first 90 or 120 days that they arrive, their whole onboarding suite. And that just became easier. That onboarding time has decreased significantly. So there's a ton of pros. So I definitely don't think we'll swing all the way back to in person, but there will definitely be a movement of people who want to train in person.
Yeah, quick anecdote there, and I think balance is really the key. Is one of the things I do hear is, yes, I hear a lot of people saying I'm kind of over the virtual side of this. I want to get back in the office, but I don't want to go back 5 days a week. That tends to be what I'm hearing the most. I still want some time at home. There are advantages to remote work. There's fewer distractions, but I miss the camaraderie and I miss the people aspect. So I don't think anyone's dying to get back on Monday through Friday 9 to 5, but maybe like Monday, Wednesday, Friday 9 to 5, and then Tuesday and Thursday still at home. I'm hearing a lot of that, and I will tell you, I really was out on assignment working with a client when Daniel recorded, and it was the first time I'd actually been in an office space. So high protocols, very few people, but still a few. And it was kind of surreal, to be honest with you, to have gone to the same office in the past where there were thousands of people working and have this time only have like 20 total people in the building. It was very odd. But one of the things you find, and I think people are going to have to adjust to this, and I think facilitators will as well, is that was the most human interaction I'd probably had over an extended period of time in almost a year. And almost every person that was there described how tired they were at the end of the day, not because they were people we disliked or people that were tough to work with. It was that was a lot more talking in person than you'd had to do. It was more movement than we'd had to do in a while. We have to be aware of those things as we come back to that. Physically, getting back in the office is actually more work than you thought it was. So I think there's going to be balance. I think people want a little bit of both. They want that human interaction. They want some adult time. We've all spent way too much time with our kids, probably, or far more than we're used to. But I think we still want some of the productivity that comes with some of the remote learning as well. So also commuting, that was not fun. I mean, I'm used to a 5-minute commute to my coffee maker and then back up to my office, and having to drive for 45 minutes to get downtown was different. But good segue into our next conversation, which is that approximately 90% of employees want to continue working from home. We've obviously talked about that quite a bit in the end of the last segment. So we won't go into too much more detail there, but at least in some capacity, they want to continue working from home. Almost 50% of workers in the same survey indicated that they want to continue working remotely for most or all of their time. So we do have folks that still want to be remote, even with that fatigue. But I imagine, to Daniel's point, you would have seen that number much higher at the beginning of this whole kind of transition. And we've probably seen quite a few people drifting more towards the wanting to get back in the office a little bit. What does that mean, though, for your content? We talked a little bit about the importance of facilitation versus content in general, but what does it mean around, maybe less around the design, but how are you going to start grabbing content that assists your learners in ways that help them on the job quickly? I think there's a few things we can talk about here. Daniel, what comes out for you the most when I talk about how does content need to shift to support that kind of a model?
I think the big one for me, and kind of where I'll start, is just you don't have to be the creator of all your content. I think that there's so much there's so much noise out there, and there's so much information and so much content that is available, that you don't have to be the pure creator of the message. It can either be self-created content by your learners. It can be blogs, videos, podcasts, other things. And we've touched on this before, but it can be a collaborative effort to curate all of that information forward to put together a good, diversified online training strategy, which will allow, when you're not always in the office, will allow for people to continue to educate themselves, continue to grow in their role, and be more flexible in their day to day.
Yeah, I love the idea that social learning is part of where content starts to come from. And I think you probably are going to see more of that as well. That not only do people want to train more, but they're finding greater passions, which I think they can turn around and make great content to support others. And so I think thinking about that is important. I also like the idea that as you're doing this, and so much of what you're doing is not face to face, you might not have a peer or a mentor or a manager that's right there on hand. How do we start to think about performance support materials as training methodologies for just in time training? When I need something, do I have it on demand? Is it short and consumable? Does it get me to where I need to be in that exact moment? Because a lot of times I am going to be more self paced in those environments where I'm trying to make a decision or act in a certain way or make a behavior change. With information, and I need to get it quickly. So I think thinking about performance support that we've typically called job aids or something like that, how do we turn those into actual training moments? And then when we think about different sectors of business, I think that's another place we can go with this is we're talking a lot about the work from home or the remote workforce trying to get trained. But what if you're not that? What if you're in the retail environment and you're out selling and you're physically in a location? We can carry that same thing over to healthcare, or we could services, essential services. There's a lot of places where we can continue to talk about people who aren't able to be remote. What does that mean? And how do you adapt that material that you're going to need on the job while in a physical place, and also consistently train those that aren't in the physical place? I think you're going to see a lot of more of that hybrid model of content where it's consumable in both locations, on demand when you need it, and supporting multiple different workforce components.
So when you talk about content curation, and that kind of, I guess, overall summary of training, are there a few industries or sectors where you have to be on the job, whether it's maybe hospitality or retail, that you think will use this uniquely or benefit from it differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certain areas where we'll probably see more companies stick to the status quo. Would be my guess when you think about things like either the hospitality or the retail sector, where you're on site. You're probably more traditional in your approach to the workplace. I think you're going to see a lot more utilization of tried and true tactics in those worlds. The reality is, I think we've talked about the perception that is leadership always putting more emphasis on the doing of the work rather than the training in those worlds. So I don't know that you're going to see the shift to letting them be more of a individual content contributor, because it's taking away from productivity time in many cases. The ability to be front facing with a customer doesn't really let you go make a unique training TikTok in the back room, right? So I think we have to think about that differently. But how do you incentivize those employees to give more in those environments? Because one of the things that I think gets missed in that is because those are such front facing, if you will, or customer facing roles, those skill sets, those individuals have a ton to offer their peers. There's so many things that are role play driven or practice driven, experience operationally, like with job aids and tip tricks and tip sheets and things like that. That I think there's a ton of content they can help with. How do you start to give them that enabled feature? I don't know that I've seen that done a lot, but I think it could become really impactful if you give them more of a voice in the training process.
I like what you mentioned there, and I think it goes back to even kind of trend number one of people looking to adopt virtual training. I guess what we talked about in terms of people educating on their own. The workplace, like we said, is becoming more flexible. And what does that mean for someone who works in retail or works in hospitality? You can be scheduled across to different areas of the business. Potentially, everybody's looking to create more effective, more efficient workforce. So when we talk about trends of things like reskilling and upskilling, that way you can perfect your craft, but also learn additional job responsibilities throughout, whether it's your company or budding departments of your industry. That way you can be scheduled in other areas, or you can assist in a job share and become more valuable as an employee, especially remotely. It makes it a lot easier to do that. So I think you're going to see that trend this year of combining your learning paths and curriculums and things with your day-to-day roles. That way you can be more flexible across different parts of the organization, which essentially will allow you to either master a number of roles you're currently in or be available to grow into other areas.
As we go into our next segment, we want to talk a little bit about what we see in the e-learning space for 2021, and where do we think things might change, shift, or stay the same in some areas. So I think that one of the things that is really going to be different this year is because people have this new workforce kind of component to their life where they are in a different place, or they might be spending more time. I think we're going to see people that still are focused on micro learning, but I think we may see it shift to become a little less of a focus this year. They may start to actually extend some of their training. And with that, I don't mean just making it longer to make it longer. I think what you're going to see is people wanting to build in other training components that can be really impactful. Things like storytelling in their content itself, trying to put more narrative behind things to make it more experiential, and building out situations and scenarios that let people sort of, to take one of Daniel's phrases, walk down the garden path of a bit more of a experiential training, and get more involved, get more ingrained in what they're experiencing. And I think with that comes the ability to sort of extend some of these trainings out and not try to cram them into just the information I need in the moment I need it, and where we were trying to be more efficient. Now, that's not to say we want it to become super long-winded and just expand them for the sake of expansion. But I think we're going to see people experimenting with other ways of delivering that message.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Experiential learning is going to be a big part of this. I think when we talk about virtual platforms, LMS, virtual events, the experience portion is it's coming to center stage. I mean, I know that conversations that I've had with our current customers, potential customers, everything's about how can we make the learning a more of an experience for our team members, more of an experience for our staff and our leaders. And that doesn't necessarily mean shorter. It may be a larger piece that they can come in and come out as they need to and be flexible. But I think Scott, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. And none of us are Nostradamus here, but we like to believe that we are. Who knows? Training could get shorter this year, but I think we're going to see the idea of building out more experiences, and bringing in a lot of different components, AR, VR, start to introduce VR into different components, but also molding in the storytelling. And I think specific characters that represent your brand throughout, it could be something that's really interesting to see from an experience perspective.
I like the notion, and again, maybe this is wishful thinking on our part, just because it's kind of what we do, and look, it's some fun. I would love to see us be, as an industry, even more creative in the way we deliver content, rather than stick to just a very formulated path. Or I'd like to see us, bad cliche, and I'm going to use it anyway, but I'd like to see us break the mold a little bit on training, and try some things that I think are going to be a little different. One of the things to consider is, in this remote workforce where people are thinking differently, they have more flexibility, but we are seeing that 62% of people are training more. We're going to need to have some variation. I don't think everything should be a cookie cutter, the same 7 slides in a formulaic pattern that, while the information in the text is different, it's easy to consume in that way. I think you're going to build some people getting into a very routine-driven approach to the way they take content. I'd like to see us break that up a little bit. Is it that you do branch stories and let people kind of choose their own adventure? Is it that, I personally love the idea of building up some training characters and doing some almost marketing or building some affinity to some brand with your content. Is it, again, more storytelling and more realism? Is it that letting people have greater voice in creating more content from a social perspective, and they become lack of a better way of putting it, YouTube sensations for your company in the way they train content, having really great representation from your actual users. I think there's just a lot of creativity that can happen there. You're trying to engage people to take content that I think is going to become more and more what we'll call optional or elective content. And that often comes with not creating something that is easy to dismiss or just click, click, click and be done. I think you want them to be more invested and choose to participate. And that's going to take some balance there that we maybe haven't had the flexibility to do in the past.
Yeah, I think when you look at 2020 and in the past, and it was a time where everybody got comfortable with the concept of virtual and the transition to virtual and how to deal with things digitally. I think the refinement, like you mentioned, Scott, and the experimenting into new different ways, whether they are bite-sized things like TikToks or little videos, or creating sort of more advanced gamification, building out characters and more of the storytelling from a marketing perspective. I think now that everybody's comfortable with the space, now is the time to experiment. And obviously budget plays into it and all those things. But if you have the ability to try things and experiment, I think the value you may lose when you don't hit the mark is going to be very small. A small risk to take to the upside you could take by breaking the mold, as you said, and taking a chance and bringing in a bunch of very traditional learners or traditional teammates and finding a way that you've completely engaged them. And I think that's, we've seen it. I know, Scott, where you were with the client last week, was a learning centric, conference, virtual conference that we put on with them. And I think the feedback from the teammates, a very non-technical group of individuals, has been amazing. And the fact that they adapted to a virtual learning, virtual conference like that has been amazing. So I think as a business, experimenting, now is the time, because you have the people who are comfortable with being online, being in front of a screen, being on a Zoom meeting and learning differently.
And just keep in mind too, when we talk about social media or social learning, not necessarily social media, but social learning as a way of letting people create and add to the conversation. One of the things that was never there in the past was the technology and the hardware for them to do it themselves, right? To create a great video required, a camera that they weren't going to go out and buy, and tripods and everything else. But we live in a place where YouTubers can create really high quality content with the camera that's on their cell phone that they all have anyway. And it doesn't need a backdrop and it doesn't need a crazy setting. And they can do a lot of this on their own. I think that has opened doors. That same conference, they took a group of people and they said, hey, we need and want some self-paced content that is elective and we want it to be different. Go. And they gave them very few rules and they gave them very little money and they gave them, a lot, not just a concept of like a title of what they wanted the course to be about. And they said, produce. And some of the stuff they came up with for folks that had not a ton of background in the creation, they were mostly folks that had delivered content. They were your facilitators. The stuff they came up with was amazing. It was so cool and done just simply by trying something new. And I loved that it worked well. I thought it was awesome. And I want to see more of that in the world. I hope that is where we are headed. Let's see. But I think we have a greater opportunity now than we've ever had in the past. All right, it's the end of our first episode of season 2. I'm super excited that we are back, but we are not going to change one thing. It is a standard for us. We want to finish every episode with a positivity point, a little something that brings some energy. I think there are 1,000 ways we could go with this on our first episode back. Obviously, this is the excitement of our first episode, and maybe that's where Daniel will go, and hopefully I didn't steal his thunder. But for me, we are launching on my oldest son's ninth birthday. Obviously, as a dad, every year he gets a little older makes me a little sad, but also like I love who he's becoming. He's got a little attitude now. I think we're hitting the tween stage, but he is becoming his own person, and just super excited to celebrate his birthday today. It's still a pandemic, so it's still a little weird, but we're gonna have some Oreo ice cream cake and open some presents, and I think he'll be super excited. So just happy to celebrate with him. That's my positivity for today.
Awesome. I am, my positivity point is definitely going to upset Scott, but that's what I'm going for, I think, in this one. Tom Brady, the GOAT, greatest of all time, seventh Super Bowl at 43 years. I just hope I can walk without a limp when 43 rolls around. So Got to give him credit. He looks younger today than he did at his combine photo, which is really, really weird. But no, I just with all joking aside, I wanted to take that shot at Scott because he beat me in fantasy football finals this year. So I feel like he deserved it. And he's a perennial Tom Brady hater. So we leave him out there. No, my positivity point is not very different than last week. Oakley turns another birthday this week. Oakley turns 1 on Saturday. She also is having a little bit of an attitude. She's becoming a toddler, which means she throws temper tantrums and all sorts of things like that. So I'm really excited for this weekend. Pandemic first birthday. My wife and I are kind of upset. It's not going to be the family thing we want it to be, but Oakley probably won't care at all. Won't even know what's going on. So I don't know why we're upset, but hey, but I'm excited. 1-year-old. I think when we started this, I was talking about how she was 8 weeks old, and it makes me happy that we've been able to make it through year 1, and I'm excited for what's next. So
yeah, I will. I don't want to alienate any of our listeners, so I'll keep my Tom Brady thoughts to myself. But first birthdays, Daniel, they're all about the parents. We hold them for ourselves. You quickly realize your 1-year-old probably doesn't remember smashing cake into their face, although the pictures are fun. So for sure, a happy week of birthdays, though. That's awesome. So a great way to start our second season, and hopefully you enjoyed the episode. We are excited to be back on the mics. That will do it for us today. I'm Scott Babcock. He's Daniel Mendonca, and we will talk to you next week.
Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Join the conversation by emailing us at podcast@haylight.com. Find us on social media at Build It, Learn It, and be sure to check us out on the web at www.haylight.com. That's HALIGHT.com.